Hello, and welcome. It's always a quiet privilege to share these stories with you, and I often wonder where you might be listening from tonight. A bustling city, a quiet town, or perhaps a remote corner of the world. Let me know in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see how far these tales travel. Tonight, we journey back to a time of immense turmoil, to the heart of a conflict that reshaped the world. This is a story of quiet courage, of a man whose battlefield was not always one of thunderous cannons and clashing steel, but often a silent, internal struggle for survival and dignity. This is the story of Tolek Klings, a man who was not a born warrior, but a typist whose loyalty and resilience would be tested beyond all imaginable limits. Settle in, relax, and let this remarkable true story unfold. The summer of 1939 was a season of nervous glances and whispered conversations in the small towns and bustling cities of Poland. A palpable tension hung in the air, a sense of foreboding that clung to the lazy, late summer haze. For Tolek Klings, a young Jewish man with a quick mind and a gentle heart, it was a time of both profound love and gnawing anxiety. His life was a simple but happy one, centered around his beloved wife, Clara, and their young son, Julius. Their laughter filled their small home, a sanctuary of warmth and affection in a world that was growing colder by the day. Tolek was not a man of violence. His skills lay not with a rifle, but with the rhythmic dance of his fingers across the keys of a typewriter. He was a proficient typist, a man of letters and documents, not of battlefields and bloodshed. Yet, as the shadow of Nazi Germany stretched its menacing fingers towards Poland's borders, the call of duty superseded all else. The Polish government, in a desperate attempt to bolster its defenses, issued a general mobilization. Tolek, like hundreds of thousands of other men, found his name on the conscription list. The farewell was a scene etched in the memories of countless families of that era, a hurried embrace, a tearful kiss, and a promise whispered with a conviction that defied the growing dread. "I will return to you," Tolek vowed to Clara, his voice thick with emotion as he held her and Julius close. It was a promise made with all the certainty a man could muster, a beacon of hope in the encroaching darkness. He, like many of his countrymen, clung to the belief that this conflict, should it come, would be swift. The combined might of the Allied forces would surely and quickly overwhelm the German aggressors. It was a comforting thought, a shield against the fear that threatened to consume them all. And so, Tolek Klings, the typist, became a soldier. He traded his crisp shirts and ink-stained fingers for the scratchy wool of a military uniform and the cold, unfamiliar weight of a rifle. He was plunged into a world that was alien to him, a world of shouted commands, forced marches, and the ever-present undercurrent of fear. But the external threat of the German army was not the only battle Tolek would have to fight. Within the ranks of his own army, he found a more insidious enemy, one that had festered in the heart of Europe for centuries. Anti-Semitism. The camaraderie that should have bound the soldiers together in the face of a common enemy was, for Tolek and other Jewish soldiers, a fragile and often non-existent thing. He was an outsider in his own army, a subject of suspicion and scorn. The taunts were a constant reminder of his heritage, a verbal barrage that was, in its own way, as unnerving as the threat of German bombs. He was a Pole, ready to defend his homeland, but to many of his comrades, he was first and foremost a Jew. The idyllic summer days gave way to the harsh reality of September. The German war machine, with its terrifying blitzkrieg tactics, stormed across the border. The Polish army, valiant but outmatched, fought with a desperate courage. The sky, once a canvas of blue and white, was now streaked with the black smoke of explosions and the menacing silhouettes of the Luftwaffe. For Tolek, the chaos of battle was a disorienting and terrifying experience. The thunder of artillery, the whine of diving planes, and the staccato rattle of machine gun fire became the soundtrack to his days and nights. In the midst of this maelstrom, Tolek's unit was shattered, the chain of command broken. The swiftness of the German advance was breathtaking and terrifying. It was a whirlwind of steel and fire that left the Polish forces scattered and broken. In the confusion, Tolek was captured. His war, he thought, was over. He was now a prisoner of war, his fate in the hands of the very enemy he had been sent to fight. Little did he know, his war was just beginning. It would be a different kind of war, a war fought not with bullets, but with wits, with hope, and with an unyielding determination to survive and to one day fulfill the promise he had made to his wife and son. The reality of being a prisoner of war under the Germans was a grim and brutal education. The veneer of civilization was stripped away, replaced by the stark calculus of survival. Tolek and his fellow captives were herded like cattle, their possessions confiscated, their dignity assaulted. The days blurred into a monotonous cycle of hunger, exhaustion, and fear. They were moved from one makeshift prison to another, each one more squalid than the last. The German guards were a constant, menacing presence, their faces etched with a mixture of arrogance and contempt. For Tolek, the situation was doubly perilous. As a Jew, he was a target of special vitriol. He was separated from the other Polish prisoners, cast into a group of men who shared his heritage and his terrifyingly uncertain fate. They were given the most grueling tasks, the most meager rations. The guards seemed to take a cruel pleasure in their suffering, a daily reminder of the hateful ideology that fueled this war. It was in this crucible of despair that the seeds of defiance began to sprout. Tolek, the quiet typist, found within himself a reservoir of strength he never knew he possessed. He was a keen observer of his surroundings, his mind constantly at work, analyzing the routines of the guards, the layout of the camps, the subtle shifts in the power dynamics. He knew that to remain a passive victim was to invite death. He had to act. The opportunity came in the form of a transfer to a labor camp near Lublin. It was a sprawling, chaotic place, a cog in the vast German war machine. The prisoners were used as slave labor, their lives deemed expendable in the service of the Third Reich. But in this chaos, Tolek saw a chance. The security, while brutal, was not as airtight as in the smaller, more organized camps. The sheer number of prisoners made it difficult for the guards to keep track of everyone. Tolek began to subtly gather information. He learned the patterns of the sentries, the moments of distraction during the changing of the guard. He made contact with a small group of like-minded prisoners, men who were willing to risk everything for a chance at freedom. They communicated in whispers, their plans taking shape in the fleeting moments of privacy they could steal. The escape was a heart-stopping gamble. Under the cloak of a moonless night, Tolek and his small band of conspirators slipped away from their barracks. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sounded like a thunderclap in the oppressive silence. They navigated by the stars, their only guide in the unfamiliar landscape. The fear was a cold, hard knot in Tolek's stomach, but it was overshadowed by the fierce, burning hope of freedom. They walked for days, their feet raw and bleeding, their bodies racked with hunger and exhaustion. They scavenged for food, their once soft hands now calloused and stained with the dirt of the fields. They were hunted men, phantoms in a land that was no longer their own. Every encounter with another person was a risk, a roll of the dice. Would they be met with kindness or betrayal? Miraculously, they found pockets of humanity in the darkness. A farmer who shared his meager stores of food, a family who offered them a night's shelter in their barn. These small acts of courage and compassion were oases in the desert of their desperation, a reaffirmation that not all was lost in the world. After weeks of this perilous journey, Tolek and his companions stumbled upon a group of Polish partisans, a resistance movement that operated in the dense forests. They were a motley crew of soldiers who had refused to surrender, their spirit unbroken. For Tolek, it was a lifeline. He was once again a soldier, but this time he was fighting a different kind of war. It was a war of sabotage and subterfuge, a war of shadows and secrets. But it was a war for the soul of his country, and for Tolek, it was a war that brought him one step closer to fulfilling his promise to Clara and Julius. Life with the partisans was a harsh and unforgiving existence. The forest was their fortress and their prison, a place of both refuge and constant danger. The threat of German patrols was ever present, a silent, deadly game of cat and mouse played out amongst the towering trees. But in this crucible of shared hardship, Tolek found a sense of belonging that had been denied to him in the regular army. Here, in the heart of the resistance, a man was judged not by his faith or his background, but by his courage and his commitment to the cause. Tolek's skills as a typist, once a symbol of a life he thought he had lost forever, proved to be invaluable. He became the unofficial scribe of the partisan group, his fingers, once accustomed to the gentle cadence of peacetime correspondence, now tapping out coded messages, forging documents, and chronicling the acts of defiance against the occupiers. His work was a vital link in the chain of the resistance, a silent but powerful weapon against the enemy. But the relative safety of the forest could not last forever. The tide of the war was turning, and the Eastern Front was a maelstrom of shifting allegiances and brutal conflict. The Soviet Union, once an ally of Germany in the dismemberment of Poland, was now a formidable enemy of the Third Reich. As the Red Army advanced, the partisans found themselves in a precarious position, caught between two powerful and ruthless forces. It was during this time of uncertainty that Tolek learned of the formation of Anders' army. It was a Polish army in exile, a force composed of former prisoners of war and deportees who had been released from Soviet gulags. They were gathering in the Middle East under the command of General Władysław Anders to fight alongside the Western Allies. For Tolek, this was a beacon of hope, a chance to once again fight for his country in a regular army, an army that promised a place for every Pole, regardless of their background. The journey to join Anders' army was another odyssey in itself. Tolek, along with a small group of his partisan comrades, made the perilous trek south, crossing borders in secret, their forged documents their only passport to freedom. It was a journey fraught with danger, a testament to their unwavering determination to continue the fight. When Tolek finally reached the recruitment center for Anders' army in Palestine, it was a moment of profound relief and renewed purpose. He was once again a soldier in the Polish army, but this time it was different. The atmosphere was one of shared experience and common cause. The men of Anders' army had all been through their own personal hells, and they were united by a fierce desire to reclaim their homeland. Tolek's skills were once again put to good use. He was assigned to an administrative role, his proficiency with the typewriter a rare and valuable asset. He was stationed in Palestine, and then in Egypt, his days filled with the familiar rhythm of the keyboard. But this was no ordinary office job. He was at the heart of the war effort, his work contributing to the larger struggle against the Axis powers. He was a long way from the battlefields of Poland, but the war was never far from his thoughts. The fate of his family was a constant, gnawing ache in his heart. He had had no word from Clara and Julius since his capture, and the news that trickled out of occupied Poland was horrifying. He could only pray that they were safe, that they had somehow managed to survive the horrors that had engulfed their homeland. It was in the sun-drenched landscape of the Middle East that Tolek found a strange and unexpected sense of peace. He was surrounded by his fellow countrymen, his days filled with purpose. He was a soldier, but he was also a typist, a man of letters in a world at war. He was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a man who had refused to be broken by the forces of hatred and violence. And as the war raged on, his journey was far from over. The path ahead would lead him to some of the most famous and brutal battlefields of the Second World War, and to a destiny he could never have imagined. The North African campaign was a brutal and unforgiving theater of war. The vast, sun-scorched desert was a landscape of extremes, a place where life was cheap and death was a constant companion. For the soldiers of Anders' army, it was a world away from the green fields and dense forests of their homeland, but the enemy was the same. Tolek, now a seasoned veteran of a different kind of war, found himself in the midst of this new and terrifying conflict. His unit was deployed to Tobruk, a strategic port city on the Libyan coast that had been under siege for months. The fighting was fierce and relentless, a brutal war of attrition fought in a maze of trenches and fortified positions. The constant shelling, the ever-present threat of snipers, and the grueling conditions took a heavy toll on the men. The desert heat was a relentless enemy, and water was more precious than gold. Tolek, the typist, was once again thrust into the heart of the conflict. While his primary duties were still administrative, he was also a soldier. He learned to live with the constant fear, to find moments of respite amidst the chaos. He shared the hardships of his comrades, the meager rations, the sleepless nights, the gnawing anxiety of not knowing if he would see another sunrise. It was in the crucible of Tobruk that a strange and unexpected event occurred, one that would earn him a nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life. During a particularly intense artillery barrage, a shell landed dangerously close to Tolek's position. The explosion sent a shock wave through the air, and a piece of shrapnel ripped through the tent where he was working, tearing through his typewriter and embedding itself in a stack of papers just inches from his head. When the dust settled, his comrades found him shaken but unharmed, a look of disbelief on his face. The typewriter, his trusted companion, had been destroyed, but he was alive. From that day on, he was known as the miracle typist, a man who seemed to be blessed with an uncanny ability to survive the most perilous of situations. It was a name that he carried with a mixture of pride and humility, a reminder of the thin line that separated life and death in this brutal war. After the successful defense of Tobruk, Tolek's journey continued. He was a part of the Allied advance across North Africa, his skills as a typist and administrator proving to be invaluable in the complex logistical operations of a modern army. He was a small but essential cog in the vast machine that was slowly but surely pushing back the Axis forces. From North Africa, Anders' army was deployed to Italy, a new and challenging front in the war against Germany. The Italian campaign was a bloody and arduous struggle, a slow, grinding advance through a mountainous and fiercely defended country. Tolek found himself in the midst of some of the most iconic battles of the war, including the brutal struggle for Monte Cassino. The Battle for Monte Cassino was a series of 4 costly and brutal assaults by the Allies against the German defenses of the Winter Line. The ancient monastery that crowned the mountain was a formidable fortress, and the fighting was some of the most intense of the entire war. Tolek, though not a frontline combatant, was never far from the action. He worked tirelessly to keep the administrative machinery of his unit running, his fingers tapping out reports and orders as the sound of battle raged around him. He witnessed the courage and the sacrifice of his fellow soldiers, the terrible price of victory. He saw men fall, their dreams and aspirations extinguished in the mud and blood of the Italian countryside. The war had become a grim and relentless reality, a world away from the naive hopes of a swift victory that he had harbored in the summer of 1939. But through it all, Tolek held on to the promise he had made to his family. The thought of Clara and Julius was a beacon of light in the darkness, a source of strength that sustained him through the darkest of days. He was fighting for them, for the future they had been denied, for the hope of a world free from the tyranny that had torn their lives apart. And as the war in Europe neared its end, Tolek dared to hope that he might soon be able to fulfill his promise and begin the long journey home. The end of the war in Europe in May 1945 was met not with universal jubilation, but with a complex mixture of relief, exhaustion, and profound uncertainty. For Tolek Klings, the miracle typist, the silence of the guns was a strange and unsettling sound. For years, the cacophony of war had been the backdrop to his existence. Now, in the sudden quiet, the echoes of all he had lost and all he had endured reverberated with a deafening intensity. He had survived, a fact that was both a miracle and a heavy burden. The world that emerged from the rubble of the Second World War was a changed place. Borders had been redrawn, ideologies had clashed, and the political landscape of Europe was a fractured and volatile entity. For the soldiers of Anders' army, the victory was a bittersweet one. They had fought and bled for a free Poland, but the Poland they had dreamed of was now under the thumb of the Soviet Union, a new and powerful oppressor. To return home was to step into a new kind of danger, to face a regime that was hostile to those who had fought alongside the Western Allies. Tolek, like many of his comrades, found himself in a state of limbo. He was a man without a country, a soldier without a war to fight. The promise he had made to Clara and Julius, the driving force behind his long and arduous journey, now seemed like a distant and unattainable dream. The Iron Curtain had descended across Europe, and the chances of finding his family, of even knowing their fate, were slim to none. The years immediately following the war were a time of aimless wandering and quiet desperation for Tolek. He was stationed in various displaced persons camps, a man adrift in a sea of humanity that had been uprooted by the war. He was a survivor, but he was also a ghost, haunted by the memories of the past and the uncertainty of the future. But the resilience that had carried him through the darkest days of the war had not deserted him. He was a man who had learned to adapt, to find purpose in the most challenging of circumstances. He put his skills to use, working as a clerk and a translator for the Allied authorities who were struggling to manage the post-war chaos. He was a man who understood the power of words, of documents, of the small but essential details that could bring a semblance of order to a world that had been torn apart. It was during this time that he made a decision that would once again alter the course of his life. He chose not to return to a Poland that was no longer his own. He, like many of the soldiers of Anders' army, was granted permission to emigrate. He chose to go to America, the land of opportunity, a place where he hoped to build a new life from the ashes of the old. The journey to America was a new kind of odyssey, a journey of hope and trepidation. He arrived in a country that was vibrant and full of promise, a stark contrast to the war-torn landscape of Europe. He was a stranger in a strange land, a man with a thick accent and a past that was too painful to share with most. But Tolek was a survivor. He found work, he learned the language, he slowly but surely began to carve out a new life for himself. He was a man who had been through the fire and emerged stronger, his spirit unbowed. The quiet typist from Poland had become an American, a testament to the enduring power of the human will to overcome adversity. And yet, the ghosts of the past still lingered. The promise he had made to Clara and Julius was a wound that had never truly healed. He had accepted the likelihood that they had not survived the Holocaust, but the not knowing was a torment that haunted his waking hours and his dreams. He had to know what had happened to them, to find some measure of closure to a chapter of his life that had been so brutally cut short. And so, with a heavy heart and a renewed sense of purpose, Tolek Klings, the miracle typist, began the final and most important search of his life, the search for his lost family. The search for Clara and Julius was a journey into the heart of darkness, a descent into the bureaucratic labyrinth of post-war Europe and the chilling archives of the Holocaust. Tolek began his quest with a fragile hope, a flickering ember in the vast emptiness of his loss. He wrote letters, countless letters, to every organization he could think of, the Red Cross, Jewish relief agencies, and survivor registries. Each letter was a plea, a carefully worded message sent out into the void, carrying the weight of a husband's love and a father's sorrow. The replies, when they came, were often form letters, bureaucratic and impersonal, offering little more than a sliver of possibility. The sheer scale of the displacement and the slaughter made the task of tracing individuals a monumental undertaking. Millions were missing, their fates unknown, their names lost in the chaos of a continent torn asunder. For every story of a miraculous reunion, there were thousands of stories that ended in a wall of silence. But Tolek persisted. The same quiet determination that had seen him through the horrors of the war now fueled his search for his family. He spent his evenings poring over lists of survivors, his eyes scanning the endless columns of names, searching for the two that mattered most to him. Each list he finished without finding them was a fresh wave of grief, a painful reminder of the chasm that separated him from his past. He connected with other survivors, men and women who carried their own stories of loss and survival. They shared their memories, their fragments of information, their whispers of hope and despair. In their shared grief, he found a sense of community, a quiet understanding that words could not fully express. Years turned into decades. Tolek built a new life in America. He remarried, a gentle and understanding woman who knew the shadows that haunted her husband's heart. He had children, a new family that brought him a measure of joy and solace. But the hole in his heart remained, a constant ache that time could not heal. The breakthrough came in the most unexpected of ways. It was not a letter from an official organization or a name on a survivor list. It was a chance encounter, a conversation with a fellow Polish immigrant who had also survived the war. They were sharing their stories, as they so often did. When Tolek mentioned the name of the small town where he and Clara had lived, the man's face went pale. He knew the town. He had been there after the war, searching for his own family. And he remembered hearing a story about a young woman named Clara and her son, Julius. He remembered the name because it was so similar to his own wife's. Tolek's heart pounded in his chest. He listened with a rapt attention as the man recounted the story he had been told. Clara and Julius had been forced into the ghetto, but they had managed to escape. They had been hidden by a righteous Gentile family, a brave and compassionate couple who had risked their own lives to save them. The man didn't know if they had survived the rest of the war, but he gave Tolek the name of the family who had hidden them. It was a long shot, a fragile thread of hope in a tapestry of despair. But it was more than Tolek had had in decades. With trembling hands, Tolek wrote a letter to the family, his words a mixture of hope and trepidation. He didn't know if they would even remember, if they would be willing to share what they knew. He could only wait and pray. The reply came weeks later. It was a letter that would change Tolek's life forever. The family remembered Clara and Julius. They had hidden them for as long as they could, but as the war intensified, it had become too dangerous. They had helped them to escape to another town, to another hiding place, and they had heard, through the grapevine of the resistance, that they had survived the war. The letter contained an address, a faded and uncertain location in a country that had been transformed by the war. Tolek stared at the address, his vision blurred by tears. After all these years, after all the pain and the loss, there was a chance. A chance that his beloved Clara and his son, Julius, were still alive. The miracle typist, the man who had survived the horrors of war and the desolation of loss, was about to embark on his final and most important journey. A journey not of war and survival, but of love and reunion. A journey to find the family that he had never stopped searching for, the family that he had never stopped loving. The promise he had made so long ago, in a world that no longer existed, was on the verge of being fulfilled. The quiet typist was finally going home.